On every street and highway across the globe, with its iconic sloped silhouette and humble reputation, the Volkswagen Beetle seems as harmless as the bug it's named after. But what if I told you, beneath that friendly rounded shell lies something much darker? Behind the Beetle's worldwide ubiquity is a little-known history steeped in unimaginable human suffering. From its inception as the Nazis' propaganda people's car to its modern emission cheating scandals, Volkswagen's past harbors shocking secrets that clash harshly with its image today. Tales of greed and cruelty that the company still struggles to fully acknowledge. In this video, we'll explore how Volkswagen managed to emerge from the rubble of World War II as an unlikely symbol of hope in rebuilding Germany, only to once again betray the trust of millions. Let's reveal the disturbing truth behind one of the most recognizable brands in the world. What if I told you that one of the world's largest automakers, Volkswagen, got its start as a propaganda tool for history's most infamous fascist regime? That its first factories eagerly employed slave labor and is responsible for the death of hundreds of children? It may sound too outlandish even for Hollywood, but for Volkswagen, such beginnings lurk disturbingly close to reality. Yes, today VW Group owns iconic brands like Porsche, Audi, and Lamborghini. But if you peel back the glossy facade, a far more troubling past emerges. See, the Volkswagen origin story remains bound to the Third Reich and Hitler's ruthless ambition. The Beetle itself, designed as a key part of his fascist vision, a sneaky tool for sinister purposes. Over the next few minutes, I'll take you on a winding journey across the decades, explaining how this company, born of World War II illegality, morphed into a pillar of today's global auto industry. You'll learn how VW profited exploiting forced labor while producing military vehicles for the Nazi war machine. We'll unpack recent emission scandals threatening to drag Volkswagen's reputation back into mud. Buckle up for the disturbing yet captivating true tale behind one of history's most controversial multinational corporations. This revelation of darkness lurking beneath the light for 3/4 of a century will leave you shocked. Origins of the people's car concept. The idea of a people's car, an affordable and practical automobile for the everyday citizen, actually predates the Nazis by a couple of decades. Surprised? I was too when I first learned this. We tend to assume the Beetle emerged fully formed from Hitler's brain sometime in the 1930s. But the true story is more complicated. See, way back in the early 1900s, cars were still mostly playthings for the rich. Your average Hans or Franz simply couldn't afford one on their modest salaries. Most folks got around by train, bike, or foot, but visionaries had already dreamed of putting ordinary people behind the wheel. Take the Model T Ford, for example. You could call that the first true people's car. When it debuted in 1908, Ford advertised it as within the reach of the average American citizen. Over 15 million ended up in driveways across the nation. So Adolf Hitler didn't invent the concept of an affordable car for the masses. That idea was already well established by the time he rose to power. What Hitler did was recognize how the right vehicle could help realize his vision for Germany. You see, Hitler had long admired Henry Ford and American industrial might. He was determined to bring a similar automotive boom to Germany, and he knew that giving citizens wheels could encourage travel, industry, and a sense of national unity. But most Germans in the 1930s still couldn't afford a car. Only 1 in 50 actually owned one, and the few German automakers limping along after the Great Depression mostly catered to luxury buyers. So when Hitler demanded a basic vehicle that could transport 2 adults and 3 children, be fast enough to cruise the autobahns, and cost less than a motorcycle, no one really took him seriously. Except, that is, for Ferdinand Porsche. But was the idea of a people's car all sunshine and roses? Or did this accessible automobile hide a darker purpose? Design and development of the Beetle. Alright, so we've talked about how the idea of a people's car actually preceded the Nazis. But Hitler still needed someone to make this dream vehicle a reality. Enter Ferdinand Porsche. Now, if you're a car buff, the name probably sounds familiar. After all, he lent his name to the legendary Porsche brand. But before that, Porsche was already an accomplished automotive engineer. Throughout the 1920s and early 30s, he consulted with all the major German automakers. His specialty? Coming up with new prototypes and designs to push performance and styling forward. In fact, Porsche had secretly been playing around with his own idea for a compact, affordable car for years, and he was heavily inspired by all sorts of forward-thinking designs of the era. Take Joseph Ganz, for example, a Jewish engineer whose 1933 Standard Superior featured a lightweight backbone chassis and rear-mounted engine, very similar to the future Beetle. Of course, the Nazis later erased Ganz from the history books. Can't have a Jew getting credit, right? Porsche also borrowed liberally from Tatra, a Czech company making sleek rear-engine sedans. The T97 even caused a post-war legal headache for VW over its similarities. But perhaps Porsche's earliest influence came from a little-known designer named Bella Barini, who sketched concepts back in 1925 that were creepily close to the eventual Beetle. I'm telling you, Ferdinand was inspired by many people. So in 1934, when Hitler requested proposals for a people's car, Porsche saw his chance to dust off his prototypes from years prior, and conveniently, his designs already aligned nicely with Hitler's specifications, including an air-cooled engine, maximum speed, fuel efficiency, and more. Porsche got the gig and refined his design over the next few years. The curvy, iconic Beetle shape came courtesy of his colleague Erwin Komenda, who designed the body. And by 1938, the car Hitler envisioned finally had a name, KDF Wagen, after his Strength Through Joy program, soon to be called the Beetle. Now, this rear-engine layout was pretty novel for an affordable economy car meant for mass production. And make no mistake, Hitler had truly mass production in mind. The Volkswagen factory he commissioned dwarfed anything that came before. The equipment alone was valued at a whopping 180 million Reichsmarks, and plans called for cranking out 1.5 million Beetles per year within 5 years' time, an insane number when annual car production in Germany was still quite modest in the 1930s. So while Porsche put the finishing touches on his design, the Nazis broke ground on a factory they boasted would be the largest auto plant in Europe, a model for the world to follow as they mobilized the German people. But we all know the road to hell is paved with good intentions, as they say, and this Strength Through Joy car would soon take some dark detours before reaching the populace. Establishment of Volkswagen under the Nazis. The idea of an affordable car for the German people had been around for years before the Nazis took power. But it took Adolf Hitler and his Nazi regime to actually make it happen. When Hitler became Chancellor in 1933, he had big dreams for the future of Germany. A key part of his vision was the building of the Autobahn, a national system of high-speed roads that would crisscross the country. But what good were roads if regular Germans couldn't afford cars to ride on them? This question led Hitler to Ferdinand Porsche, who had been developing prototypes for a people's car for over a decade. Porsche's early attempts hadn't succeeded due to a lack of funding and interest, but now he had the full backing of the German government. The Nazis saw the people's car as a way to highlight the supposed benefits of National Socialism. So in 1937, Porsche founded a company called Gesellschaft zur Urbanheiten des Deutschen Volkswagens, which translates to something like Company for the Preparation of the German People's Car. This was soon shortened to the name we know today, Volkswagen. The very next year, the Nazis broke ground on a massive new factory near the town of Volksleben. This factory was so enormous that an entire community was constructed around it for the German workers. Propaganda Minister Goebbels called the project a symbol of National Socialist People's Community. Tens of thousands of German citizens even paid into a savings program, setting aside 5 marks a week toward the 990 mark total cost of their future car. But here's the tragic part. Almost none of them would ever receive one. So what went wrong? Why didn't Hitler deliver the people's car he had promised? In short, the war intervened. Once World War II broke out, the Volkswagen factory switched from civilian car production to exclusively manufacturing military vehicles and munitions. And it did so in part by exploiting thousands of forced laborers from concentration camps. The city of the KDF car, built by the Nazis, failed to ever produce a single people's car for German citizens. But the factory and its workforce would go on to drive Volkswagen's growth in the post-war years into one of the world's largest automakers. So in many ways, the Nazi dream of giving ordinary Germans the freedom of car ownership was never realized. But the machinery and resources they assembled at Volkswagen allowed the company to prosper once the war ended. Wartime shift to military production. So the Nazis sunk huge resources into this massive Volkswagen factory in an adjoining city. They promoted it heavily as a sign of the prosperity and mobility they would bring to the German people. But did they deliver on that promise? Not even close. The stark reality is that not a single civilian Beetle was produced for German citizens before World War II intervened. As soon as the war broke out in 1939, the Volkswagen plant immediately halted car production and switched its focus to manufacturing military vehicles instead. All those German families who invested their savings into a dream car would end up getting nothing for their loyalty to the Nazi regime. Now, you'd think diverting a civilian car factory to make army transports would be complicated, but the Beetle prototype turned out to be conveniently convertible to military use. By basing new vehicle designs on the Beetle's chassis and engine, VW produced over 50,000 Schwimmwagens and Kubelwagens for the German war effort. Does anyone recognize what those weird names translate to in English? Amphibious cars and bucket cars. The Kubelwagen was basically a Beetle chassis with a bucket-shaped body on the back for ferrying around troops or gear, and the Schwimmwagen could operate on land as well as in water. So while no consumer Beetles reached German families, VW was able to innovatively adapt their people's car into versatile military versions instead. Of course, rapidly retooling an automobile factory to build army transports took a tremendous amount of labor. At its peak, about 60% of VW's workforce consisted of prisoners from concentration camps or forced civilian laborers. Can you even imagine being abducted to a foreign land and forced to assemble the very vehicles used to invade your own country? The conditions these slave workers endured were truly horrific. Fed only meager rations, they experienced abuse and deadly neglect on a regular basis. But Volkswagen wasn't the only German company profiting from concentration camp labor. Practically the entire war industry depended on it, including other big names like Mercedes-Benz, BMW, and IG Farben. It was a vast network of cruelty that permeated across the German economic landscape. When the Allies liberated Volkswagen in April 1945, only about 6% of the workforce remained, and the factory was in shambles from lack of upkeep and Allied bombing raids. Hard to believe this skeleton crew once churned out thousands of military transports during its darkest days under Nazi control. The story of Volkswagen's birth and its undelivered promise foreshadowed even deeper troubles ahead. Volkswagen's child victims. One of the most tragic chapters in Volkswagen's history was the merciless treatment of infants born to female, foreign forced laborers at their factory. As we learned earlier, a large portion of VW's wartime workforce consisted of abducted civilians from countries like Poland and the Soviet Union. Some of these so-called Eastern workers arrived pregnant, and with both male and female laborers housed together, relationships formed that resulted in more pregnancies. Before 1943, expecting mothers were deported back home before giving birth. But as Germany's war fortune deteriorated, the need for labor trumped all else. Fritz Zuckel, the director of forced labor allocation for the Reich, ordered pregnant workers to remain until the final months of pregnancy. To get these women back to the assembly lines as fast as possible, Volkswagen worked with Zuckel's office to set up an on-site maternity facility. essentially a holding pen for newborns. Promoted as a nursery, its real purpose was to take the babies off their mother's hands immediately after delivery. Overseen by VW's lead doctor, Hans Korbel, this so-called children's home was located first in the Eastern Camp Barracks, then moved to the nearby town of Rouen. But infant care was clearly not the priority. Labor officials didn't concern themselves with the baby's survival once separated from their mothers. Housed in overcrowded, inadequately heated rooms, hundreds of infants wasted away from exposure, starvation, and disease due to gross neglect. It's estimated that 365 babies died from the intentional maltreatment at Rouen. When British forces liberated Volkswagen in 1945, they were so horrified by the condition of the surviving children that Dr. Korba was sentenced to death for criminal misconduct. He was executed in 1947. So in their ruthless pursuit of productivity using forced labor, Volkswagen enabled the deaths of hundreds of innocent lives. And this painful legacy still casts a long shadow over the company today that most of the people are unaware of. Post-war occupation and eventual independence. Volkswagen's factory was in shambles after producing thousands of military vehicles using forced labor during World War II. So what comes next for this tainted industrial site? Well, the Allied forces now occupying Germany originally wanted to just dismantle Volkswagen and liquidate its assets. Can you blame them, with the dark legacy of exploitation under the Nazis? But one British officer named Ivan Hertz saw an opportunity amidst the rubble. Major Hertz realized that the Volkswagen factory, with some fixing up, could provide much-needed transportation for rebuilding Europe. So he fought for permission to have it repaired instead of demolished. By 1945, his mechanics had a small fleet of Volkswagens operating again. Over the next few years, Hertz slowly restarted production under British control. About 1,000 Beetles were being built per month, mainly for military and governmental use. Doesn't that number sound tragically low compared to the Nazis' goal of 1.5 million per year? But these modest beginnings laid the groundwork for Volkswagen's eventual independence from occupation authorities. In 1949, the company was finally returned to German management under a guy named Heinrich Norhoff, and almost overnight, Volkswagen shed its Nazi origins and became a symbol of West Germany's economic turnaround. Through smart, small-scale manufacturing focused solely on the Beetle model, Norhoff led VW to become one of Europe's largest automakers within a decade. By 1955, they hit the major milestone of 1 million Beetles produced. It's fascinating how Volkswagen transitioned so quickly from its darkest days using concentration slave labor to become a thriving pillar of German industry again. Did the world just suffer collective amnesia about its past? And the Beetle itself went from a failed Nazi propaganda project to a countercultural icon of personal freedom in the 60s. Volkswagen cleverly rebranded itself in America as an honest, nonconformist underdog compared to the flashy wastefulness of domestic car brands. So by creatively adapting to both post-war hardship and global popularity, the company left its problematic history behind to drive itself into the future. Global success and brand expansion. Volkswagen made an impressive turnaround in the 1950s, rebuilding trust through the Beetle's reputation for reliability and honesty. Could they maintain momentum as consumers' preferences evolved? Well, throughout the 60s, the Beetle was still going strong as one of the top-selling cars across North America, Europe, and beyond. Its distinctive bug-like shape made it instantly recognizable around the world as an emblem of German industry. But behind the scenes, Volkswagen knew they couldn't rely on the Beetle forever, so they began snapping up more brands to diversify their offerings. Any long-standing car buffs here who can name some of their biggest acquisitions back then? That's right, throughout the 60s and 70s, VW purchased Auto Union, NSU Motorworks, and the Spanish car maker SEAT. This allowed them to expand into more upscale markets by integrating emerging technologies into new Audi and Lamborghini models. By the early 1970s, Volkswagen had clearly grown from an upstart newcomer into a dominant force to be reckoned with. But just when they seemed unstoppable, the 1970s oil crisis came along. Skyrocketing gas prices created demand for more fuel-efficient compact cars, which should have played right into VW's sweet spot. But increased competition from Japanese automakers like Toyota and Honda threatened the Beetle's standing. While Volkswagen struggled to adapt quickly, those Asian imports kept nibbling away market share through the 80s and 90s. It's wild to think how the Beetle went from a counterculture icon to seeming downright antiquated over a single generation. Now facing serious financial troubles, do you think Volkswagen could pull off yet another great escape and rebound? Modern troubles and scandals. By the 1970s, VW was flying high as a global juggernaut with the iconic Bug leading the way. But the party couldn't last forever. With new emission standards and rising competition from Japan, cracks began showing in Volkswagen's armor. See, for all its nostalgic charm, the Beetle was still an antiquated design under the hood. Its air-cooled, rear-mounted motor decidedly old school next to modern, water-cooled engines. By the mid-70s, VW was clearly behind the curve adapting to new regulations and market demands. Sales slowed to a crawl in the crucial U.S. market. Dealerships shuttered as Americans turned increasingly to sleek, fuel-efficient Japanese models like the Honda Civic and Toyota Corolla. Does this scenario sound familiar today? Well, by 1993, it had gotten so bad that VW's U.S. sales sunk to just 63,000 cars. Peanuts for what was once the world's top automaker. Now, to Volkswagen's credit, they managed to stop the bleeding with some new front-wheel drive family cars, like the Passat and Golf. But still, they struggled breaking out of their stereotype as a hippie car with limited appeal. Attempts to go upscale with premium pricing and high-end brands like Audi also failed to draw mainstream American buyers, and lacking serious investment in new technologies, even bestsellers like the Jetta and Golf grew dated next to ever-improving competition. By the 2000s, VW was floundering again. In desperation, they reintroduced a new retro Beetle in 1998, which saw some initial success thanks to nostalgic boomers. But history would repeat itself as sales eroded quickly. Clearly, the Bug's day in the sun had passed. Yet amid these renewed struggles came what appeared a moment of salvation: the promise of clean diesel engines. These supposedly reduced emissions while boosting fuel economy. And for a brief time, TDI diesels helped Volkswagen stage a comeback in the era of $4 a gallon gas. What customer wouldn't want a green car that drives like a peppy Golf but sips fuel? Well, it turns out this diesel tech was too good to be true. Fast forward to 2015, and U.S. regulators exposed an audacious emissions cheating scheme involving software defeat devices. Essentially, VW programmed its engines to artificially dial back emissions whenever lab tests were conducted. Truly a brazen deception that betrayed customer trust and landed Volkswagen in hot legal water for violations coming and going. Billions were spent on fines and settlements. Executives resigned and even faced criminal charges in America. And it raised uncomfortable questions about whether dubious business practices ran deeper in VW's culture. Was this scandal just the tip of the iceberg or an isolated impropriety? I'll leave it to you to decide. In any case, Volkswagen once again found itself at a crossroads and its reputation sullied among environmentally minded car shoppers. Legacy of a controversial history. As we wrap things up, it's worth asking, what exactly is Volkswagen's legacy after all these years? Well, on the one hand, you can't deny the company's tremendous business success. This little car company has transformed into a 12-brand global conglomerate, giving us iconic nameplates like Porsche, Audi, Bentley, and Lamborghini. Regardless of controversies, Volkswagen seems resilient time and again. Today, the VW Group remains as the world's largest automaker, producing over 10 million vehicles annually. Not too shabby for an enterprise born of Nazi propaganda. Of course, PR headaches persist around that unsavory genesis. But VW has taken laudable steps confronting its past like few German firms. There was an independent corporate history commissioned in the 1990s, and more recent acknowledgments of using wartime slave labor. Unlike some, Volkswagen hasn't whitewashed responsibility, providing money for compensating elderly survivors. The company deserves modest praise for these efforts, however imperfect. On the automotive landscape, the Beetle's legacy eclipses even Volkswagen itself. After all, that distinctive silhouette remains recognizable as Apple or Coca-Cola decades later. And its impact permeates modern car DNA. Fuel-sipping four-cylinders, cabins prioritizing people over engines, even EV adoption. Conceptually, today's affordable crossover owes much to the people's car, the Mini Cooper, Prius, and Nissan Leaf, too. But can we evaluate this success considering the initial problems that led to it? Can we separate the creator from the creation? These questions have always shrouded Volkswagen. Even recent unpleasantness around Dieselgate and ethics summon the ghost of World War II illegality. It's as if the company's authoritarian origins forever taint its corporate DNA. So where does Volkswagen go from here? Will ambition stay ethically grounded moving forward? Or will lust for profits and glory triumph integrity? Can an old dog learn new tricks? I don't claim to know, but for better or worse, this car maker's past, present, and destiny seems fused to broader questions of human progress itself. However far Volkswagen travels down a redemption road, its former identities tag persistently behind. That's the supreme irony of the people's car story. Yet who knows? Perhaps the next chapter leads to clarity and wisdom as innovation presses on. The road ahead remains open. Where it takes Volkswagen is anyone's guess. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to smash the like and subscribe button. Until next time.